So cochlear implants have been approved for adults by the FDA since 1985 and for children since 1990. However, they continue to be overwhelmingly underused, and really only about 2.8% of those who are candidates actually receive a cochlear implant. And so one of the biggest components, one of the important components of candidacy and tracking progress is speech perception testing. And so several years ago, one of my colleagues and I started to notice differences in the speech perception testing results of the Spanish speakers and the English speakers. And we noticed a couple things. We noticed one, that it seemed as though that the Spanish speakers were achieving a higher percentage on their scores. And we also noticed that they seemed to be hitting those high scores earlier in the process. And so we said, well, why are we seeing such differences? And so we started taking a look at the literature, and we found a few things within comparing English and Spanish. And we found that with Spanish, there are more multisyllabic words, and English, there are more monosyllabic words. So we proposed for our study that the Spanish speakers were going to perform better on the Spanish test than the English speakers on the English test. And we also proposed that the bilingual patients were going to perform better on the Spanish test over the English test. So why are we seeing these differences? And we had, all these thoughts, and so we came up with a couple of things that, maybe there are different levels of proficiency in each language. At what age was a second language acquired? And for the bilingual recipients, maybe Spanish really is easier to hear or understand than English. Maybe the Spanish materials are really that much easier than the English materials. And I do have to point out that it is documented that the Spanish list that we use for this project is easier than the English sentences. However, during the time that we were taking the data, it was the only resource that we had to test our Spanish speakers. And we were just happy to start somewhere. And so finally, we also thought about maybe there are cultural differences between the Spanish and the English speakers. With the Hispanic community, the Hispanic population tends to be more communal, and maybe there are, more family members under one roof. Maybe it's a little noisier. Maybe there are more people talking over each other, right, Roxana? Right, using the hands. And you guys saw the scores in Spanish, maybe that's why they're scoring, that much more. I don't know, but these are some of the things we want to take a closer look at in the future. A couple of other things that we also did not analyze here. We did not look at language dominance, socioeconomic status, or education. Like I said, those are things we'd like to take a closer look at in the future. So what does this mean for me as a patient, right? Well, in a nutshell, it's important to have a nice, big, comprehensive picture of your abilities. And we can think of that in terms of candidacy, and we can think of it in terms of tracking progress.
As I think everyone here well knows, hearing loss is incredibly common. It's one of the most common conditions that affects all people. On the y-axis here is prevalence, meaning how common hearing loss is, going from 0% to everybody at 100%. And on the x-axis is age by decades of life. And you can see that as you get older, you are virtually guaranteed to get hearing loss if you live long enough. About 100% of people who are 100 have hearing loss. This slide shows the same thing in another way. On the y-axis is the amount of hearing loss you have, expressed in a threshold with the unit being decibels. And at the top here, 0 means perfect hearing, and at the bottom, 70 is severe to profound hearing loss. And on the x-axis, again, is age. And you can see as we all get older, the average hearing declines and declines. And we can draw a red line through what we often define as the border between normal and abnormal hearing. And by age 60 to 70, about half of people are below the line, meaning they have what we would usually clinically define as hearing loss. So hearing loss, very common. There are actually a lot of papers suggesting, or I should say, saying that it is good. This is one paper that looked at people who were in their 80s and 90s who had cochlear implants, and it showed that they do very well and the side effects are very low. I had to look up the word nonagenarian. I didn't actually know the meaning of that word. This is another paper by a group showing similar findings that cochlear implants in the very elderly, the outcomes are good and the side effect levels are low. And this is a paper by one of my colleagues at Columbia, Anil Lalwani, and Maura Cosetti, who's also in New York, showing the same thing, that cochlear implants in the elderly are safe and they're also effective. And I'm just going to read you a couple quotes from the abstract, the summary of this paper. They wrote, overall, current data supports a high level of perioperative, meaning around the time of surgery, and long-term safety for elderly patients undergoing cochlear implantation. And skipping to the last sentence, elderly patients benefit significantly from cochlear implantation with respect to speech outcome and quality of life. Thus, advanced age should not limit candidacy for cochlear implantation. And just to reiterate, cochlear implants safe, effective in older adults. Age alone is not an impediment to getting an implant. And hearing loss is undertreated, and we all collectively need to do something about that. So thank you very much.
So as it's been stated already, CI utilization rates in this country, I think, are low. So just under 13% of US adults who are likely to meet CI criteria actually have an implant. And that rate decreases to around 2% if you consider the expanded cochlear implant criteria, which are single-sided deafness and asymmetrical hearing loss, as was discussed earlier this morning. And so we know that there are certain patient populations that are at risk for low utilization of CI. And so we'll talk about those populations today. First are patients who live in rural areas, patients who are of non-white race, older patients, as was just discussed, and then patients with public insurance and of course with no insurance. Without insurance, you cannot get a cochlear implant unless you've got $100,000 to spend. And of course, insurance type is a proxy for SE status. Approximately 20% of the US population resides in rural areas. In a study out of Kentucky, looking at patients in rural Appalachia, Matt Bush out of the University of Kentucky found that patients who live in rural areas take about 5 years longer than patients in urban areas to get a hearing aid. And then when looking at cochlear implants, the difference was 7 years. 7 years longer for rural patients to proceed to cochlear implant surgery than patients living in urban areas. And those differences have an impact on patients' lives. Rural patients in their study were much more likely than urban patients to report losing their job because of troubles with their hearing. Rural patients also, on average, typically have lower levels of education, lower household incomes, and have to travel a greater distance to a CI center. And the reason for that, of course, is that many CI centers, like much of medical care, they typically exist in urban areas, in large cities. Over a 9-year period, they took a look at the demographics of their cochlear implant patients, and they found that around 90% of their cochlear implant patients were white, non-Hispanic, and English-speaking. And this was not reflective of the population of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which is just 47% white, 71% non-Hispanic, and 68% English-speaking. In this study, they found that non-white patients were half as likely than white patients to pursue cochlear implant surgery. And there can be a number of reasons for that, and it's difficult to assess that in a retrospective study. But we see that not just in cochlear implant surgery, we see that across other surgical fields where Black or Hispanic patients are less likely to pursue surgery or to pursue technology than white patients. In this study, they also found that older patients were less likely than younger patients to pursue surgery, but that difference wasn't as big as the difference with race. And then the last topic we'll touch on is insurance, specifically looking at Medicaid insurance. For pediatric patients, Medicaid as well as private insurance typically covers the cost of cochlear implantation. For adults, however, only about 60% of states offer Medicaid coverage for cochlear implantation. In the state of Georgia, where I practice, Medicaid does not cover adult CI. And so if you're under the age of 65 and you don't have Medicare or private insurance, you can't get a cochlear implant. Actually, in our office, you can't even have a hearing test. They have to go to the public hospital for a hearing test. We also see in our practice young adults, so people who are 20 years old, 23 years old, who have aged out of their Medicaid insurance, but who were implanted when they were younger and had Medicaid coverage for implant. And these patients come in with their processors taped together and not working. And we can't help them because Medicaid does not cover the implant once they age out. And so really it's dependent on the practice patterns of the primary care doctor or the ENT physician or the audiologist to say, hey, I think we need to get you a hearing test, or hey, you might be a candidate for cochlear implantation, let's send you for testing. And so that creates opportunities for bias, and it also can exacerbate disparity. Many savvy patients, educated patients, can know to ask about cochlear implantation, and that's all of you in the audience. But many people have never even heard of it and unfortunately think of hearing loss as just an inconsequential part of aging, and it's not inconsequential. In 2020, the group out of Michigan with Terry Zwolen recommended a screening guideline for cochlear implantation. And so they recommend a 60-60 rule. So if your pure tone average, so the hearing volume level on your hearing test is greater than or equal to 60, or if you're scoring less than 60% word recognition on a standard hearing test, you should be sent to see if you meet criteria for cochlear implantation. And with this, they catch about 96% of candidates and then have about a 34% false positive rate. But we'd rather have one in the office to watch to see when they do meet criteria than to miss out on patients who should be having an implant. And so how can we improve access? I think first we have to increase awareness and reduce misconceptions about cochlear implantation. And these topics have been mentioned today. Patients come into our office and they think that cochlear implantation is brain surgery. It's not brain surgery. It's not supposed to be, at least, unless you get one of those complications of a CSF leak, but that's rare. So it's not brain surgery. It's not experimental. That's a question we get from time to time. I get that more at the VA than I do at Emory. I spend a day a week at the VA, but it's not experimental. You're not a guinea pig, and I think that's unfortunately an attitude of veterans, understandably. Residual hearing, people worry about losing what hearing they have left. In many cases, there's not much left to lose. But in some cases, there's hearing that can be preserved. But with advances in technology and advances in surgical technique, we can often preserve hearing. It's not a guarantee, but it's possible. And so we need to increase the awareness among the general population so that you guys spread the word, among audiologists and among primary care physicians.
So why is it important to preserve that low-frequency natural hearing? Well, sound awareness without the implant. So if you're sleeping and you don't have the implants on, you can still hear the fire alarm or the smoke detector, and this is important for safety. People with residual hearing that use a cochlear implant can understand speech better in more challenging environments like noise, like going to a restaurant or going to the grocery store or having dinner with the family. People with residual hearing can also hear music better. They can hear tones and pitches, and that may be also important for tonal languages like Mandarin. So how can we reduce injury to the cochlea? There are many researchers all over the world looking at different designs for the cochlear implant electrode array, the part that goes into the cochlea. looking at different designs that can reduce injury to the cochlea. There has been amazing advances in the past 10 years. How do we block inflammation? So in the 2000s, several labs across the United States and the world were looking at corticosteroids, applying them locally, orally, intravenously, to be able to reduce the inflammation that causes our hair cells to die off. And if we're able to do that, we can protect the auditory hair cells and also prevent some of that scar tissue and new bone formation that forms around the implant after we do the surgery. And that can also affect the residual hearing. But we show on a lot of different experiments that we've published over the years that dexamethasone is protective against inflammation and the type of inflammation that causes the auditory hair cells to die off.